Okay. This week's reading, we read about the species that qualify for a korban, the sacrifices. And the Torah tells us, shoro chesed ways, whether it's an ox, whether it's a sheep or a goat, he yivolid, yeshivas yomim tachzimo. The first 7 days of its life, it remains with its mother. From the 8th day onward, does it qualify to be used as a korban, to be sacrificed for Hashem? Meaning, up to 7 days, during the 7-day period, although it's a kosher species, it's unblemished. Since it hasn't reached its 8th day of existence since its birth, it does not qualify. Only from the 8th day onward, then does it qualify. Where do we find something which is the equivalent of this? A child is born, a Jewish child, male. The Torah tells us, on the 8th day, you circumcise the flesh of his foreskin. You're not supposed to, circumcision is not before the 8th day. So the Midrash tells us, now, what is Shabbos? The Kedusha, the sanctity of Shabbos is what? The Talmud tells us it has a semblance of the world to come. So the Midrash tells us that every child who lives 8 days, before he's going to be circumcised, he's going to experience a Shabbos. He's going to be exposed to the Kedusha, the spirituality, the holiness of Shabbos, and only then will he be circumcised. The animal, which is consecrated to be brought as a korban, a sacrifice, if it doesn't qualify until the 8th day, that means the animal also, before it's brought as that korban Hashem, it's brought as that sacrifice for God, to be burnt on the altar, to be able to utilize that, the most advanced level of sanctification, it has to first be exposed to a Shabbos. And only then, after it's been exposed to the sanctity of Shabbos, only then does it qualify to be the korban. So the child only enters into the covenant of Avraham Avinu, which is circumcision on the 8th day, because he's already been exposed to the Kedusha, the holiness of Shabbos. Identically, the animal, it doesn't qualify, although it's the right species, until it's 8 days old, because it has to first be exposed to the Kedusha of Shabbos. That's the understanding. Now, what's this all about? We speak about Shabbos me'in olam haba. Shabbos has a semblance of the world to come. What is the world to come? The world to come is you have a relationship with God. As the Talmud tells us, tzaddikim yoshim v'choseim b'rasheim. Tzaddikim, they sit and they're wearing their crowns on their heads. The crowns means their spiritual accomplishments during their lifetimes. And they benefit from the radiance of the divine presence. You're having a relation with God, being exposed to that radiance. That's the ultimate level. That's olam haba. Shabbos is me'ain. It has a semblance of that. God's presence enters every 7th day of the week into this existence. The world reaches a new level of spirituality. And due to that spirituality, it has a semblance of the world to come. And that's why it's so serious. If a Jew violates the Shabbos, it carries the most severe level of penalty. Why? Because if God is here, God enters into this existence and he spiritualizes this existence. How do you engage in something which is contrary to his will? It's in his presence. Just a semblance of this concept. Every nation of the world has an archangel. There's an archangel for the Egyptians, for the Romans, for the French, for the Germans. Every nation has an archangel. That archangel is an intermediary between the nation and God. The Jewish people have no intermediary. Because of our relationship, what happened at Sinai, we have a direct connection to God. We have no intermediary. Now, every location in the world somehow identifies with one of the 70 root nations. The Africans are in Africa, the different nations of Africans. Each nation has its spiritual habitat based on the degree of spirituality it has. And the angel, which is the intermediary between that nation and God, is in that location. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is called Eretz HaKadosh. It's called the Holy Land. Israel is called the Holy Land. Eretz HaKadosh. Why is it called Eretz HaKadosh? Because that's God's location. That's where God is. God's presence is in Israel. Although his presence is all over, but in terms of the consecrated presence is there. Now, in Kabbalistic works, it's cited that when you're in Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, you're bepalten shel melech. It's like you're in the palace of the king. Because that's where the Shechin is. That's where the divine presence is. You're in the palace. When you go outside of Israel, you're in what? You're at a distance from the palace. A person comes into the palace and you're in the location, the domain of the king, and you transgress on his domain and do things which are against his will. And you transgress in his kingdom, but it's not in his palace. It's the exact same action. Which action has greater liability? The action, the transgression which takes place in the palace, or the transgression which takes place in the hinterlands at a distance from the palace? There's no question. The person who has the audacity to transgress, to violate the Torah, the will of the king in the palace, it shows a greater level of what? Of even irresponsibility or defiance, or even if it's not a defiant. How do you give yourself a priority in the presence of God? It's the ultimate level of what? Of brazenness. Therefore, the transgression is much more extreme. If you sin outside of Israel, you're not in the palace. That has liability, doesn't have the same level of liability. If you do a mitzvah in the palace of the king, if you do a mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael, and you do that same mitzvah outside of Eretz Yisrael, the value of the mitzvah in Eretz Yisrael has multiple value because you're honoring the king in his presence. You come to the king, you honor him in his presence. You do it outside of Israel, that mitzvah, although you're doing the same mitzvah with the same focus, the same intent. It doesn't have the same dimension. It doesn't generate the same level of holiness as the mitzvah that's done in Israel. The mitzvah in Israel has greater value because Israel is palten shel melech. You're in the palace of the king. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, of Israel, you're not in the palace of the king. So it works positive and negatively. That's what it is. Shabbos, wherever you are in the world, God enters into this existence differently than his realms to this existence during the weekday. During the weekday is called Chol. Chol means ordinary. Shabbos is called Kodesh. Kodesh means holiness. Shabbos is a consecrated day. We have in the first set of 10 commandments, it says, Zocher es yom HaShabbos l'kadsho. Remember the Shabbos to sanctify it. There's a positive commandment on Shabbos to sanctify the Shabbos. What is that commandment? There's a mitzvah on a Torah level to say Kiddush. Kiddush Friday night on Shabbos, we fulfill a positive commandment. Well, that's the 10th commandments. Zochas Yom HaShabbos l'kadsho. Remember the Shabbos to sanctify it. It's acknowledging the holiness of Shabbos, that God's presence is here. And that's why the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, that every Jew, every Shabbos when it begins, is endowed with an added dimension to a soul. The soul on Shabbos expands. It's called Neshama Yisera. Every Jew has an additional aspect to his neshama. It expands, it becomes enlarged. That's what happens when Shabbos begins. Why? Because when the soul is exposed to God's presence, it's drawn out. It becomes enhanced. And it becomes enhanced, we experience things differently. And therefore, the Talmud tells a story. There was one of the members of the Talmud, a non-Jew, invited himself for a dinner at the Jew's house, at the great rabbi's house. And the non-Jew says to the rabbi, the food that you're serving tonight tastes phenomenal. Could you tell me what's its special ingredients that you add to the food? So the rabbi says, the ingredients is called Shabbos. That's the ingredients we add on the seventh day. It's called Shabbos. And that enhances the food. You can eat the same cuisine during the weekday, and you eat it Friday night or Shabbos, it has a different taste. Exact same recipe. It's different. Because when you're eating that food on Shabbos, you're experiencing within a spiritual context. You internalize it. It's a different experience. During the weekday, the Shekhinah, God's presence, withdraws. Why do we have B'samim in Havdalah Saturday night? The B'samim, which is spices, are like smelling salts. Person feels faint. We smell the smelling salt, or ammonia, it revives you. Because we lose that spiritual dimension every Saturday night, we have to be like restored. How do we restore ourselves? When we say burn something, when we smell and inhale the spices, that's a restoration of our soul. It puts us back in balance. But that's the concept of B'samim Saturday night. Why we smell B'samim with Havdalah. Because as the Shabbos goes out, the Shekhinah leaves, we feel bereft or abandoned, and there's like a low feeling. That is like to revive us. That's the concept of B'samim Motzoi Shabbos, Saturday night, that we have. So what is Shabbos? It's God's presence. And the Medrash says, what is it analogous to? A person wants to have an audience with the king. So the protocol is that before you meet the king, you have to meet with his leading minister. First, you meet the leading minister, and after you meet the leading minister, then you could go and have the audience with the king. So the Midrash says every child has to first experience of Shabbos, to be exposed to the sanctity of Shabbos. That's the equivalent of meeting the minister. You already have a degree of orientation of what Shabbos is, what God is. When you circumcise the child, you're entering into the covenant of Avram. And now you're removing the foreskin. Now you're entering to have a full relation with God. And therefore, now this is the audience with God. Now you're ready for real time. Identically, the korban, the animal, the three species, the ox, the sheep, and the goat, have to be spiritualized to a degree. It's not enough verbal consecration that we consecrate it. It has to be exposed to a level of divine presence. That's Shabbos. Now that the animal has been exposed to that, come to the eighth day, it goes onto the altar to be sacrificed. Now you're serving God at the most advanced level when you bring a sacrifice. It's interesting. The Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos, the world stands on three principles: Torah, Avodah, Milos, Chasodim. The study of Torah. Avodah is the service of Hashem, that sacrifices, and doing acts of loving kindness. What's Torah? Torah itself is Torah Hashem Tamima. When you study the Torah, the words, the concepts, you're actually partaking and being spiritualized, you're cleaving to God. The Torah itself is the extension of God himself. And therefore, when you study Torah, it's part of a spiritualization process. We say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. The Vilna Gaon writes that one word of the Torah, every word we study is a positive commandment. One word of the Torah is the equivalent of all 613 mitzvos. That is the mega energy that lies in one word of Torah. So when we study the Torah, the level of attachment which we bring about between ourselves and Hashem is the ultimate level of attachment. It creates a spiritualization of one of a kind. What's avoda? Service. The Kohen is the only one who actually could officiate in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple. He is our representative. Avoda. That's a direct connection with God, as we're saying now. Until the eighth day, the animal doesn't qualify to be put on the altar. It's only once it's been exposed to a lesser level of sanctity, it goes to the ultimate level. Gemilas Chasodim. What's Gemilas Chesed? Gemilas Chesed is, why did God create the world? The whole intent of the world was, David says in Tehillim, Olam Chesed Yiboneh. The world being created is an expression of God's kindness. He wants man to be the ultimate beneficiary of his choice, that he should be able to have a relationship directly with God. With God. So what is Chesed? Chesed allows you to cleave to God at the most advanced level. That's what it does. The ox, the sheep, and the goat, although it's meets the criteria of a kosher species and they're unblemished until the eighth day, it's too early. They haven't matured sufficiently. They haven't gone through the protocols of spiritualization to be ready and be worthy to be put on the altar. To have that level of service, that intimacy with God. The child until the eighth day is not ready to have that intimacy with God, to have that foreskin taken off, which is the impediment to spirituality. Because we discussed many times, Adam was created without a foreskin. It was only once he ate of the Eitz Hadas, he ate of the tree of knowledge, which was good and the evil expressed itself as the covering on the male's organ. The mitzvah of Milah that was given to us, we're able to minimize the effect of that evil by removing that foreskin. A non-Jew was never given that mitzvah. It's purely cosmetic for a non-Jew. But for a Jew, when we remove it, we're actually peeling away, removing an obstruction which allows us to have a relation with God, and our spiritual channels are open, and we're able to internalize and process things which you cannot process if you have a foreskin. And that's why an adult who's not circumcised, it carries a very hefty liability. It carries the liability, although you're passive, of course, spiritual excision. Because it's an obstruction. It doesn't allow you to have a relation with God. Because it represents the evil of the Eitz Hadas, of the tree of knowledge. Therefore, God says, until you remove that, we have no relationship. What spiritual excision? You have no relationship with Hashem. Therefore, the liability of an adult who doesn't circumcise himself is that's the liability. You have no relation with God. Why does a father have an obligation to circumcise his child? Again, a parent brings a child into this existence as you have to care for all his physical amenities, physical needs. You have to care for his spiritual needs. At the eighth day, that's the earliest you remove that foreskin. That's an obligation on the father to the son. If he's a firstborn, day 30, you have the mitzvah of pidyon haben. You redeem the firstborn. You teach your child how to swim, because swimming is an important ability so the child shouldn't drown. You have an obligation to teach your child a craft. He should have a livelihood, a vocation. And of course, the father has an obligation to teach his child Torah, which is the ultimate. Talmud Torah and Klum, that's your spiritual lifeline. That's the value. And that's the purpose of being in this existence. So the father orients and conditions and shares and allows the child to be infused with the teachings of the father or he delegates it through a rebbe, a teacher, to communicate these beliefs and these concepts, and to actually go through the process of the study of Torah itself. We read in Pirkei Avos that if you have 5 people together and they study Torah, Shchini Moyim, the divine presence is with them. You have 3 people study Torah together, Shchini Moyim, divine presence with them. You have 2 people study Torah, Shchini Moyim, the divine presence with them. You have 1 person study Torah, also the divine presence with him. So Maral of Prague asks, so if 5, the divine presence is with him, and even 1 is, so what's the difference between 1 and 5? Every setting where you study Torah, the Shekhinah is present when they study. So he explains, we're not saying the intensity of the divine presence is the same. Of course, there's no question. 5, it's much greater. 3 is less. 2 is less than 3. You think maybe 1, there's no divine presence. No, even 1, there's a degree of divine presence. But we're not saying every setting is the same level, intensity of divine presence. As we're saying, Shabbos is Me'ein Olam Haba. It's a semblance of the world to come, but it's not the world to come. It's a semblance of God's presence being in this existence. But he's fully not here as he's in the world to come, or he will be in the recreated world, which is the 8,000th year. With God, we fully present and integrated in with the human being, which was the original intent of creation. How many kosher species are there? To be a kosher species, if it's an animal, domesticated, undomesticated, it has to have 2 signs. Has to chew its cud, has to have split hooves. If it has 1 of the 2, it's not sufficient. And if it has none, definitely, it's not a kosher species. But if it has both, it's kosher species. Now, in total, how many kosher species are there? Domesticated, undomesticated. The 10 kosher species. 7 of the 10 are undomesticated. 3 of the 10 are domesticated. Which 3 are domesticated? The 3 that qualify for the korban, for the sacrifice. Shor, kesef, the ox, the sheep, and the goat. Those are the ones that qualify for a korban. If you want to bring a deer as a sacrifice, it's not valid. So the question is, why the domesticated species, which are 3, and not the undomesticated? First, it's interesting. The Medrash tells us that we know that the whole concept of bringing a sacrifice is atonement. The concept of atonement only exists within the context of Midas HaRachmim, only within the context of the attribute of mercy. Because you'll never find, we know that the appellation for the attribute of mercy is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Elokim is the attribute of din, of judgment, and Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the 4-letter name of God, that's Midas HaRachmim. It's the attribute of mercy. Whenever the Torah speaks korban, which is sacrifice, it's korban l'Hashem. It's not a korban le'Elokim. Elokim has no relevance to bring to atonement. That a God is agreeable to forgive and allow you to be rehabilitated, reinstated, that's only because of Midas HaRachmim. Attribute of mercy. Every day we say in the Shmon Esrei, in the Amidah, Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. The God of Avram, the God of Yitzchak, the God of Yaakov. Hakeil Hagod Lagiv Vanoro. The great, the powerful, the awesome God. Then we say, Zocheh Chastei Avos. He remembers the kindness, the accomplishments of the Avos, of the patriarchs. So the reason why God gives us endless choices to always be in a position make choices is the merit of the avos, of the patriarchs, the holy patriarchs. That's zochech as the avos. What happens when their merit is depleted? Then he will bring the goel. As long as the Mashiach hasn't come, the Redeemer hasn't come, that's the indication there's still reserve in the bank. We still have spiritual reserve. That's zochech as the avos. Okay? So whatever we have, it's not in our own right, it's in conjunction, because we have the backing of the schus avos, the patriarchs' contributions, what they accomplished. Now, not that the ox atones, it's in whose merit? It brings atonement. That's Mitzvah Rahman. In whose merit do we have the ox? In whose merit do we have the sheep? In whose merit do we have the goat? That the goat atones. It's the species that atones. So the Medrash tells us, in the merit of Avram Avinu, we have the ox. In the merit of Yitzchak, we have the what? We have the sheep. In the merit of the goats, in the merit of Yaakov, we have the goats. Why? Because when the Torah speaks about Avram Avinu's hospitality, when the three angels come to tell him that Sori Menu will have a son, which is the patriarch of the Jewish people, immediately it says, Ela Boka Rotz Avram. He immediately ran to the cattle to prepare the meat that's needed for the guests. So the merit of he ran to the boker, to the cattle, which is the ox, that's why the ox atones for us. The story of the Akedah. Avram was about to slaughter Yitzchak, the Akedah. All of a sudden, God says, the angel says, withdraw your hand from the lad. Do not slaughter him. And all of a sudden, he locates a ram, an ayil. An ayil is a sheep. The sheep was brought in the place of Yitzchak. So the atonement of a sheep that it atones for us is the merit of Yitzchak. Yitzchak wants to bless Esav because he's not aware that he sold the birthright to Yaakov. And he says to Esav, before I bless you, I want you to prepare delicacies for me. So he goes, his mother summons him, Rivka summons Yaakov and says, your father wants to bless your brother before he passes away. The blessing is rightfully yours. I'll prepare delicacies for your father. And I will prepare the delicacies. He says, go to the flock and bring 2 goats. And she prepared the delicacy from goat meat. So in the merit of the goats, Yaakov received the bracha of the birthright, blessing of the birthright. So therefore, the reason why the goat qualifies to be the sacrifice, the species, it's the merit of Yaakov. So although we have 10 species, kosher species, but it's only because these 3 species were utilized in these contexts, whether it's hospitality, or whether it's the Akedah, or it's to prepare the delicacies to make Yaakov the beneficiary of the brachos, which guarantees the survival of Jewish people. That's the reason why these are the only species which bring about atonement for that reason. The other 7 have no relevance to that. Therefore, it can't activate the necessary energies which will bring about atonement and reinstatement as a Jew. That's the understanding. But the Medrash offers another reason, another 2 reasons. Why only these domesticated and not the 7 others, which are kosher species, which are undomesticated? The reason given is this, very interesting. A domesticated species, how does it live? Who cares for its needs? The master, the one who owns the ox, the sheep, the goat. These animals eat from the trough of its owner, from the trough of the owner. Animals that live out in the wild, undomesticated, they eat what they find, they forage in the forest, wherever they are. That's the basis for their sustenance. But a person who raises a domesticated species, the domesticated species is nourished and fed from the means, from the belongings of the owner. And it eats, the word is, it eats be'evus b'olov. It eats from the trough of its owner. Now, when you bring a sacrifice, why do you bring a sacrifice? For atonement. It's interesting. It seems to be, and the Or Chaim HaKadosh asked this question a few weeks ago, it seems to be contrary to understanding how it happens. God created the world based on the laws of justice. Fair justice. A person sins, he deserves to die. But God says, if he brings a sacrifice and meets all the criteria of sacrifice, and he does tshuva, and he repents, I will take the sacrifice in his place. Yes. The sacrifice will be the equivalent of him. And when he's slaughtered, he thinks, truth is, I deserve to be slaughtered. My blood deserves to be sprinkled. My remains deserve to be burnt. I'm bringing the animal in my place. So the Chaim asks, it's contrary to fairness. The human being sins, and you take the animal and use the animal to be your scapegoat, so to say. How is that equity? How's that fair? You sin, you assume the brunt of the responsibility. But why does God accept the animal in the place of the person? So Or Chaim HaKadosh says something phenomenal. He says, a rational person, understanding the liability of sin, would you sin? You wouldn't sin. It's only because, as they say in Israel, the person has a juk in his head. He has some kind of craziness, enters his head, and he becomes a little off-balanced. It says, there's a certain spirit of foolishness which goes into the person, which causes him to behave irrationally. There's a certain irrational behavior at that moment. So therefore, as a result of that's why he transgresses. When a person realizes he did the wrong thing, and he does tshuva. So when he sinned, he has a semblance of an animal. As an animal is an unintelligible creature, when a person sins because his intelligence component malfunctions at that time, therefore he has a semblance of the animal. You take an animal for the act of an animal, which is the transgression. When the person realizes he did the wrong thing, and he does tshuva and he repents, who is he now? He's no longer the animal. He is that special human being. How do you take a human being for the act of an animal? That's the reason why the animal qualifies as the replacement in place of the person. Okay? And that's why the person, when the slaughtered animal, in his mind, he feels, in truth, it's only due to God's mercy, his rachmim, he's taking the animal in my place. I should be slaughtered. My blood should be sprinkled. I should be burnt. The animal's coming in my place. So you have to see the animal as yourself. Now, the domesticated animal, how's it nourished? It's nourished and fed by the trough of its owner. We find Yeshaya Novi, before the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, he rebukes and admonishes Jewish people. He says, you Jews, the animal, the donkey, recognizes the trough of its master and it behaves properly. You people, you don't recognize your master. He underwrites you and you walk and you act and behave as if he doesn't exist. You're less than the animal. A chamor, a donkey, who's this unintelligent physical creature, recognizes avus ba'olav. It recognizes the feed bag or the trough of its master. And you people don't. And that's why you sin. So these animals that you bring in your place, what are those species? Domesticated means they're nourished and sustained by the trough of their owner. That's exactly what the korban represents. You should have recognized who your benefactor is. It's Hashem. Because you fully didn't appreciate who your benefactor is. Therefore, you felt entitled you could do certain things, which is unjustified. So you bring the animal, because the animal represents the species domesticated, that it has a master who provides its fodder through the trough for that reason. And that's what the Medrash means. These three species are sustained through the trough of their owner. The 7 others which grow up in the wild, whether it's the jungle, the forest, that species does, because it doesn't have that level of representation of what was the basis for the failing, that you didn't recognize the hand that fed you. And as we say, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. But when the person transgresses, you don't appreciate that hand that feeds you. You don't appreciate the trough. As a result of that, you were careless, you sinned deliberately, whatever it was all because of that. Therefore, it's these 3 species specifically which are domesticated, not undomesticated, for that reason. The other reason, which is given, very interesting reason, the whole concept of korban is midas harachmim, it's the attribute of mercy. There's a medrash that tells us, it's interesting, there's certain similarities on, now we count Sfira. We have 7 days of Pesach, and we count towards Shavuos. On the 50th day, we celebrate the giving of Torah Sinai, Shavuos. So it's 7 and what? And Shavuos is like the 8th day. Except on Sukkot, we have the 8th day following immediately after the 7th day. It's called Shmini Atzeres. Right? We have 7 days. Hoshana Rabbah is the 7th day of Sukkot. On the 8th day, we have Shmini Atzeres. And that's when we complete the Torah, on Shmini Atzeres. So there's a parallel between Sukkot is 7 and 8. Pesach is 7 and 8. What's the 8 of Sukkot? The 8 of Sukkot is Shavuos. The 50th day is 7 times 7 is 7. It's the 8 after 7 multiples of 7. So it's 8. And the Alkut says, the Medrash says, in truth, after Sukkot, we should not have Shmini Atzeres. We should wait 50 days. And on the 50th day from Sukkot, the beginning of Sukkot, that's when we should celebrate Shmini Atzeres. But why don't we? Because when do we celebrate Sukkot? In the fall, right before the winter. If the Jews would come back to Yerushalayim during the festivals, there's a mitzvah to visit the Temple Mount. That means the Jews, wherever they are, they have to come back to Yerushalayim. 50 days later, we're talking about you're in the middle of winter. There's snow, there's ice, there's rain, the roads are muddy. God says, something, truth, you really should come back 50 days later. Because 50 represents 8. That's something which transcends nature. But if I ask you to come back in 50 days, that means you're going to suffer all kinds of hardships because you're in the middle of winter to come back through the snow and the rain and the hail. Therefore, you know something. The 7th day's over, let's do the 8th day immediately. But in truth, it should be 50 days later, like what? Like Shavuos. Shavuos is 50 days later. Because that represents the pinnacle of spirituality. The Rebbeinu Bachya explains that the days between Pesach and Shavuos, which we're experiencing now, is the equivalent of Chol HaMoed. Just as you have Chol HaMoed, the semi-holiday status, we call it the intermediary days. They're holy, but they're not fully holy. The days between Pesach and Shavuos are the same concept. Of course, you're walking and making the trek to come to the destination, which is Shavuos. That's when we achieve the pinnacle of our spirituality, on that 50th day of Nisan. We find that when the Mishkan was built, the Jews could not bring an egel. They could not bring a calf for their atonement. Why? Because there's a principle, because why did we need a Mishkan? Because we failed with the golden calf. So we were given the Mishkan to be the medium to have a relation with God. So the reason why we couldn't bring an egel, which is the species of the golden calf, because ein katega nasus haneger. A prosecutor cannot be an advocate. Since the egel, the calf, represents idolatry, that would be prosecution. Therefore, we don't bring the egel. We bring a goat, not the calf. Because a prosecutor cannot be an advocate. But yet, the shore, the ox, is the species of the egel. You'd say, even though the ox qualifies to be a species, mention it last. It should say the sheep, the goat, and the ox. But the ox is mentioned first. Why? Why is it mentioned first? So there's beautiful medrash. Medrash says, what is it now? There was a king, he was on a trip. And when he was way on the trip, word went out that his Secretary of State had an affair with the queen, with his wife. And he hears this. He's very upset. He's seething. He comes back. He launches an investigation. And he finds out the whole thing was false. False, slander. But in the kingdom, it's known, word is out, that the Secretary of State, the leading minister, committed adultery with the queen. So how does he somehow vindicate the Secretary of State? So he had an idea, the king. What did he do? He made a banquet. And he made a banquet. He invited all his subjects of his kingdom to come to this banquet. And who is the guest of honor at this banquet? The Secretary of State. And where does he sit? Right next to the king as the guest of honor. So people say, this doesn't make sense. If in fact, what we heard has any truth to it, how does the king give this man such great honor? You know what the answer is? The whole thing's false. So to vindicate the Secretary of State, he put him next to him that people should understand that what was said is baseless and false. It's purely slander. Identically, the nations of the world come to the Jewish people and say, something, you think you have a relationship with God. Who are you fooling? Within 40 days after you heard God speak to you, you go and get involved in idolatry. So the Midrash says, when we did the Egel, it says, Ela Elohecha Yisrael. This is your God, Israel. Now, if we initiate it, it should say your God, say our God. Why does it say this is your God? You know who initiated the golden calf? It was the rabble that came out of Egypt with the Jewish people. They initiated it. Because they initiated, we were seduced. But it didn't come from us. But how do you know that? You know how you know it? Because when God speaks about the species which qualify to bring about atonement, you know what the first species it's mentioned? The ox. The ox is the egel. If in fact it has any truth to it, the way the nations of the world are processing it, at least the ox should be the least of the three. No, that's first and foremost. The most special of the three is the ox. But how could the ox be? That's where you failed. The answer is we didn't fail on our own. We were seduced. We were seduced by the rabble. Therefore, shor is mentioned first before the sheep and the goat, because that the world should know that we were always committed and we're still committed to him. It was only due to this influence that we slipped and we failed. I once mentioned many years ago, there was a person who lived in Vilna who was a leading Torah sage. His name was Reb Shlomo Stershin. The YIVO Institute has a library. It's called the Stershin Library. The Stershin Library was owned by a person by the name of Reb Shlomo Stershin, who was known as the Rishash. He was a banker in Vilna, and he was a Torah sage. His commentary is printed in back of the Talmud. He was a chavrusa with Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. They studied together, and he was a banker. And he would lend money, and a person borrowed money from him. And the person borrowed money was a little bit of a seedy character. He was a peddler in Vilna, and he was happy to lend him the money. One night, he has a knock on his door, and this person is returning the debt. Cash in an envelope, and he gives it to the rabbi who's studying. Without thinking, he takes it, slips it into his Gemara, continues learning. A few weeks later, the rabbi reviews his books, and he realizes that this debt made by this peddler wasn't paid. So he summons the peddler. He says, according to my ledger, you didn't pay the loan, and it's overdue. So the person says to Rabbi Shtershim, he says, I paid it. Don't you remember I came late at night and you were studying and you took it, this and that? He says, I have no recollection. I have no recollection. However, I'm not going to take you to court because we don't adjure people to take oaths, but I'm going to let it go. That's what happened. He let it go. But factually, we're talking about the most prestigious holy rabbi in Vilna. This peddler connived. Once word got out that he had an issue with Rabbi Shtershim, people say, you know something, we're not going to patronize this man any longer. If he has the brazenness to even take advantage of the rabbi, we're not going to patronize him. He's out of business. This person leaves Vilna in disgrace with his family. Fast forward a little bit, the rabbi studying that tractate, all of a sudden he finds the envelope with the money in it. And it all comes back to him that the man did pay. But he realizes he destroyed this man's life. This man became persona non grata. He became a pariah, forced to move out of town. Nobody would look at him. So he feels he's devastated, the rabbi. He finally locates him. He says, look, whatever financial loss I caused you, I will fully reinstate you, put you back in the business. You will not have an iota of loss due to what my mistake. So he says to the rabbi, he says, you know something, everybody knows you're a great tzaddik. And they'll say, but it's really not true. Really, I am the culprit. But the reason why the rabbi did it, because he saw the way I was suffering, therefore he concocted this new story that he did pay. How could the people believe it? So the rabbi says, you know something, there's one way which will confirm what I'm saying is the truth, and they'll believe it. I have a son, you have a daughter. We'll make a shidduch. Your daughter will marry my son. And if that happens, there's no way people say, because I'm a tzaddik, I'm marrying my son to your daughter if you are that kind of person. So that I agree that to marry my son to your daughter, that tells the world that you're not what people think you are. You're much better than that. Hashem says, people believe that we initiated the golden calf and we have no relation. Hashem says, the first optimum choice of a species to be brought as a korban, is the ox. But the ox is the idolatry. That tells you that they are not the culprits. Who are the culprits? The Erev Rav, the rabble, they were the culprits. Therefore, the first mentioned, which qualifies to the korban, is the ox and not the sheep and not the goat.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do this.